Great. Well, I kind of feel like I just saw all of you because I did just see all of you. But thank you for making your way into this room for really basically sort of our keynote address of the day. I'm really excited to welcome Nick Clegg of Meta here with us today. We were just talking about the impact of climate change on democracy, and now we're going to be talking about the other really, I would say possibly even most hot button issue of our time, which is AI and technology. And so Nick, thank you for making your way to Athens and for joining us. And it's actually kind of timely that you're here because for those of you who might have had an opportunity to check out the New York Times earlier this morning, my colleagues had a big story about Meta's most recent sort of attempt to personify AI, to make AI friendly to all of us with these new chatbots that you guys have introduced to run on your social media apps. They've got a Jane Austen chatbot, Snoop Dogg, and according to my colleagues who basically went to Meta headquarters and chatted with these folks, with these bots, Jane Austen sounds just as precocious and biting as one would expect Jane Austen to sound, and Snoop Dogg, according to a reader who already wrote in on the story who interacted with him, was a lot of fun. So, I mean, AI obviously holds enormous promise and can do, you know, all kinds of new things. AI can even help us possibly solve some of our hardest problems. But as we just heard on this video, it also comes with a very broad set of risks, including manipulation, disinformation, and the existential threat of it being used by bad actors. So, Nick, let me just ask you, why should the public trust that AI will be a boon rather than a potential threat for democracy?
Well, I think the public should continue to reserve judgment until we see how things play out. And I think, like any major technological innovation, technology can be used for good and for bad purposes, can be used by good and bad people. That's been the case from the invention of the car to the internet, from the radio to the bicycle. And I think it's also a natural human instinct to fear the worst and to try and anticipate the worst and to be fearful, particularly of technologies which are difficult to comprehend and so on. So I think it's not surprising that a lot of the focus in recent months, certainly since ChatGPT sort of produced its large language model, has been very much focusing, if in a somewhat imprecise way, on a range of possible risks. I think some of those risks, or at least the way some of them are being described, are running really quite far ahead of the technology, to be candid. This idea of AIs developing a kind of autonomy and an agency of their own, a sort of demonic wish to destroy humanity and turn us all into paper clips and so on, which was quite a lot of the sort of early kind of early discussion.
Terminator 2 status.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it's fun to have robots with glaring red eyes, and I think that's clearly at least not yet the case, because these are systems, remember, which they don't know anything. They don't have any real meaningful agency or autonomy. They are extremely powerful and sophisticated ways of slicing and dicing vast amounts of data and applying billions of parameters to them to recognize patterns across a dizzying array of sort of data sets and data points. But generative AI, unlike, if you like, traditional AI, is generative. It can predict the next word, the next token, and so on, but it doesn't know what the inherent meaning of those words are. So I think we need to adjust a little bit to some of the somewhat breathless fears. But nonetheless, I think it's probably fair to assume that, like a lot of these technologies, it will act as an accelerant for trends that already exist. So to take your point about elections and things, there's nothing. Photoshop's been around for ages. You've been able to produce deep fakes for ages. People can churn out, and indeed they have done, misinformation. For all I know, they were churning out misinformation at the Agora, at the foot of the Acropolis, several thousand years ago. It's sort of, the idea of people fibbing or trying to mislead is not new, but I think these technologies generally allow you to do that, or allow bad people to do that at greater scale and velocity. So I think one of the questions, certainly for big platforms like Meta and others is, can the sort of sword, I'm mixing my metaphors, but can it be a sword, not just a shield? And I think it can. I mean, if you look at the progress that has been made on social media platforms in recent years by AI already, it's quite encouraging. And if you look at the a good example would be hate speech on Facebook. Quite rightly, for a long time, a real focus of attention. The prevalence of hate speech, and I'm not just making this up, this is sort of audited data and so on, now stands at around, in other words, how much hate speech is there as a percentage of the total content? It's around between 0.01 and 0.02%. So for every 10,000 bits of content that you'd be scrolling, if you were scrolling endlessly and mindlessly on Facebook, you might find 1 or 2 bits of hate speech. I wish it was 0. I don't think it'll ever get to 0. But here's the thing. It is down by about 50 or 60% because of advances in AI. And as you know, AI systems are basically pattern recognition systems. So if you can train those AI classifiers to recognize a pattern, which you can, for instance, with hate speech, it becomes an incredibly effective tool in that adversarial space, even if people are generating it more, to also counteract it more. And the same will be true for misinformation, same will be true for almost anything that you're trying to police on these platforms, because if our policies and systems and technology are working as they should, in a sense, we should be agnostic about whether it's generated by a machine or a human being. If it violates the rules, or of course still more in a more extreme fashion, breaks the law, then the system should be able to detect that. And these systems are so powerful now that I'm quietly confident. I'll give you another very concrete example. One of the great problems for the platforms on misinformation has been that even if you get an independent fact checker to identify something as false or partially false, and then you demote it and you cover it with an interstitial which says, this has been identified as in one shape or form misinformation. The great problem is being that the people who generate that misinformation then slightly alter the content. Yeah. And so you're constantly playing whack-a-mole, and what these generative AI systems, in fact, we've been running some experiments internally, which I was just looking very recently at some of the results, are hugely encouraging, because these generative AI systems will allow us to, yes, identify a piece of content that we either want to demote or label or filter, or even in extreme cases remove. But here's the key thing. We now are capable, using this technology, to fan out across all of the different apps and identify adjacent or slightly altered content.
But do you think that, what you're talking about is actually sort of going to be enough to keep up with some of the bad actors? You mentioned the term bad actors. That remains one of the biggest sort of concerns out there. One of the things that, Meta is obviously one of the biggest players, along with Google, et cetera. And the approach that the different companies in sort of, the arms race that the big tech companies are taking on AI has been quite different. In the case of Meta, for example, Mark Zuckerberg has said that he is going to release sort of the coding for your AI, because that would be in the interest of the greater good. Other people from anywhere in the world could basically go into that and improve it. And yet, there's a lot of pushback on that. Bill Gates, on the other side of that argument, basically says it's an incredibly dangerous thing, because if bad actors get their hands on Meta's AI, we could go down a rabbit hole. So, are you prepared for this Pandora's box that is possibly being opened here?
Look, if you look at the history of the internet, it's been built through open source technology. Dare I say it, Bill Gates and Microsoft were involved in quite a famous battle with Linux and open source technology. And open source won out. And it won out not only because it was often more innovative, but crucially because experience suggests that open source technology is also safer, because you get the wisdom of a crowds applied to it. Mm-hmm. So not only did we open source our large language model over the summer, called Llama 2, in 3 different sort of 7 billion, 13 billion, and 70 billion parameters, and then in 2 forms, in a sort of crude pre-trained form and then in the fine-tuned form. But we then actually, along with many other companies, we submitted the model to DEF CON, actually, in Las Vegas over the summer, to allow hackers to sort of do their best, or rather do their worst, to really stress test the flaws.
Yeah.
And that, in a sense, is the spirit of open sourcing. And it's not, in a sense, we're not making this up. We've been open sourcing for a long time. Over the last 10 years, we've open sourced over 1,000 AI databases and models. I think the key thing on this debate, open versus closed, is not to be dogmatic about it. Of course, there are circumstances where you shouldn't open source. Just a few weeks ago, our researchers came up with a new, extraordinarily powerful tool which can take a snippet of your voice, like literally a tiny snippet of your voice, and extrapolate it perfectly to mimic your voice. Now, clearly, you don't want to open source that. So we haven't done that. But where possible, I think it is generally better to do so, because you democratize access to the technology. So it's not just a handful of big American and Chinese companies who've got the GPU capacity and the data to run these models, which are incredibly expensive. It's billions of dollars you're talking about. Yeah. You democratize access to it for academics, for researchers, for entrepreneurs, for developers, and so on.
So there's no danger, though, of a bad actor getting there, not acting in the sort of positive.
But there's always a danger of bad actors always using bad technology. In the same way that a bad actor getting behind a wheel of a car can do a great deal of damage with that car, plowing into a crowd of innocent bystanders. It's not whether it's open or closed that determines whether bad actors will try. And I think the experience suggests that one of the advantages of open sourcing is that you get far more signal about how these systems could be abused. But as I say, listen, if we ever approach as a world to that sort of somewhat dystopian vision of what's called artificial general intelligence, where these models develop an autonomy and an agency of their own, then of course you're in a completely different ball game, and then I think the debate completely changes.
So we're real happy that you're here, and we know you have limited time, and so we were also told that you weren't going to be able to take audience questions, but I therefore took the liberty of going around to the audience the last couple of days and asking folks what they would like to ask you. And one of the main questions that kind of kept coming up was actually this issue that you just raised, which is sort of, don't the tech companies have a massive responsibility for making sure that it doesn't sort of get out of control? Yuval Noah Harari, who the eminent historian who's spoken here a number of times, has pointed out that sort of the difference in technological advancements that humans have made in the past, whether it be in the Industrial Revolution or even sending man to the moon, has been that we've always been in control of that technology. What we have here at Meta and at other companies is basically a new program that is being taught to be sort of self-learning. And that also includes governments working on this to create, for example, self-learning weapons. So, are you not kind of frightened by that? Do you think that is too dystopian a thought?
Yeah, it's far too
versus,
dystopian. I think it's far, because it's not what the technology does. Of course I understand.
Can it be programmed to do that?
Well, of course, as I
Or
said
learn itself
before,
to do that?
this technology, you can't litigate with any precision about the precise use of any foundational technology. And this is not an app. This is not a piece of hardware. This is not an application. This is foundation. It's as foundational as iOS or Android. It's like it's like the sort of fundamental architecture by which all of us will interact with the online world in the future. Will it be abused by some people? I'm afraid, yes, it probably will be. But does that mean that one should be unduly pessimistic about the balance of benefit versus drawback? No, I think some of the rhetoric is somewhat sort of breathless, really. Not least because the technology right now doesn't suggest that it has that autonomous ability.
I think you recently said the technology right now. Recently, you mentioned that the technology is sort of too dumb to do.
Well, in a very strict sense, it is. Yeah. And of course, that's why we're all grappling with it. That's why we're talking about it in forums like this, which is, in one sense, you ask it to write. I was helping my 14-year-old the other day. I couldn't give much help, by the way, but he had to write a school essay about the Treaty of Versailles. Was it too punitive? Did it sow the seeds for the subsequent eruption of the Second World War? Classic sort of school essay. And as I was trying to sort of help him. I thought, gosh, I can just ask ChatGPT. It can probably produce a perfect essay, and then we can probably fiddle with it and make it sound like something that's been produced by a 14-year-old. So in one sense, you think, wow, it's so clever, it can marshal that. But on the other hand, it doesn't know anything innately. It has no idea what the words mean. It's just an incredibly sophisticated way of guessing with sort of predictively by being able to draw patterns from huge numbers of cross associations, what might be the next. But that's why these things hallucinate. That's why they come up with rubbish, because they just kind of spin up a series of predictive. Now, there's a very, very interesting debate, which you may be aware of, amongst some of the true frontier thinkers about AI. So if you look at the three so-called godfathers of AI, Yoshua Bengio, Geoff Hinton, and Yann LeCun, who all won the Turing Prize in 2018, they disagree amongst themselves. Yann LeCun, so I know him best because he's a professor at NYU, but he's also one of our chief AI data scientists. But if you listen to that debate, there is a school of thought that says that large language models, they're not even going to be the future of AI, because how many times can you keep reconsuming the internet and applying ever more sophisticated parameters to it? So there is a view that says, in fact, the future of AI is going to have to go in a completely different direction, sort of get out of this large language model cul-de-sac, that's what they say, and build something which doesn't require nearly as much data and is actually in many ways easier to control. So I would urge those who immediately want to jump to conclusions that it's going to be a dystopian future to just consider a bit what the technology is and what it is not, to consider that we've kind of had this tendency as humanity to assume the worst of each kind of turn of the wheel when new technology develops, and that maybe there isn't going to be this sort of, how can I put it, this sort of linear exponential increase in these large language models. It might actually go a bit like this, and maybe AI will look quite different to what it currently is predicted to look like within the next decade.
Yeah, you mentioned ChatGPT. I actually asked ChatGPT to come up, because I didn't yet have access to the new bots that you guys put out, the Meta AI. So I actually asked ChatGPT, just for the heck of it, to come up with a couple of questions for Nick Clegg about the dangers that AI could pose to democracy. ChatGPT actually spat out 12 questions, a dozen questions, ranging from AI's role in deepfake technology to inequality. Some of the questions were sort of softball questions like, what role should companies like Meta play in addressing this issue? But some of them were actually pretty hard and obviously reflected the widespread concerns that are in the hive mind, about this. And so actually I'm going to ask you one of the questions that it came up with. We've got 2 billion people voting in elections, in the world next year. We know that AI, and this is the AI saying this, we know that AI is increasingly being used to manipulate voters with tailored content. Can tech companies keep up with this?
I think I'm at risk of repeating what I said earlier. I think in this adversarial space of misinformation and disinformation, which are sort of subtly but importantly different things, I think it is undoubtedly the case that these systems could be used to accelerate the genesis or the generation of content that you don't want. But I think certainly as far as social media platforms are concerned, we are still in control of distribution. So yes, more could be generated, but that doesn't mean it was necessarily going to be seen by people or distributed. That is something which, those are levers we can and indeed do pull pretty aggressively, as I said earlier in the sort of the illustration of how AI is being used to suppress hate speech. So I think it's worth thinking of this conceptually as there's generation and then there's circulation, and I think one of the things we need to do is work out, and this is a big cross-industry issue in my view, and it's one that I believe governments and the industry as a whole need to work on urgently, is if you can have cross-industry-wide standards on being able to identify when something has been, particularly a visual image or video has been, particularly short-form video, has been generated by AI, either through explicit watermarking or invisible watermarking, then actually if you can do that, and you can set those standards across the different platforms, it's actually not rocket science to then throttle or limit the distribution of the material that you don't want circulating very widely. I think the issue we have at the moment is that everybody's coming up with different standards of watermarking or not watermarking. So one of the announcements that we made yesterday is that there's a new tool that you can use well, it's starting in sort of beta form in the US only at the moment. It's called /imagine, and you can use it on Messenger or Facebook, Instagram, and you can basically, with a text prompt, you can come up with photorealistic imagery. And then it will have a very clear watermark saying, this has been produced by, I forget what the watermark exactly says. But there are other...
It's been produced by AI, essentially, that it's a fake
But there
image.
are other photorealistic AI outfits out there that don't have any explicit watermarking. And remember, these platforms are not hermetically sealed from each other. So particularly when people want to disrupt elections, they don't only focus on Facebook or only focus on X or only focus on YouTube or TikTok or something. They really try and flood the whole zone. And a lot of the content that is generated on one platform, of course, will migrate to others. Yeah. So my own view is that it is, and I say this to a lot of the governments and regulators I meet, is that I worry that we are spending quite a lot of time and energy speculating on existential threats from AI which may or may not arise in many years to come, when right now, ahead of those elections where 2 billion people are going to be casting their ballot, we need standards now on common watermarking standards. Because we can do whatever we can, for instance, on Facebook, to explicitly watermark our generative AI image production tools as we are. But if others don't, it's going to be totally confusing to users, and we won't be able to police the content that comes from off-platform onto our platform.
You mentioned sort of regulation. You all were obviously sort of at the White House for this recent meeting where all of the big tech players, who are all the ones that are in this arms race, basically to make their AI, bigger, better, smarter, faster. You all, met, with the president, with lawmakers to basically talk about guardrails for AI. But one of the other questions that I heard, a lot from the people in this room over the last several days was the fact that a lot of these commitments to set up these guardrails are voluntary and don't really have any enforcement. You just talked about, companies putting their own watermark on fake images, but is that enough? And why should the public trust that the tech industry would do a good job of sort of regulating itself or sticking to any guidelines when the tech industry doesn't exactly have a great track record of doing that in the past?
It's not what the tech industry is saying. The tech industry is saying there needs to be regulation, but regulation is slow. So in the meantime, we're coming up with a number of, what do you want? That we don't come up with voluntary commitments? It's the only thing we can do at the moment in the absence of law. So I sort of slightly feel it's a no-win situation. So what, we come up with voluntary commitments, can't criticize it because they're voluntary. They're voluntary because there isn't hard regulation. I think everybody in the industry recognizes you do need hard guardrails on some of this stuff in law. And ultimately, of course, and ideally, which is why you have this, I'm in Tokyo and Kyoto in a couple of weeks' time because the Japanese government is leading a G7 process on this. The UK government is hosting an AI safety summit in early November. And quite rightly, governments are trying to also not only decide what they feel needs to be put onto their own statute book and domestic law, but also what needs to be done collectively, because this is technology which doesn't recognize borders. But to get the ball rolling, I hope it's not a bad thing that the industry is saying, look, you need uniform standards on transparency. You need uniform standards on red teaming and stress testing. We had 350 people stress testing for 6 months, thousands of hours, our AI tools, to try and really understand where the vulnerabilities were. You need clear transparency so people understand what data is used and what's not used in the training data, what the model weights are, how have they been assembled. You definitely need industry-wide cooperation on watermarking and what's called provenance and detectability. Now, in the absence of law, and in the absence of lawmakers working out what they want, the industry is moving forward. We have something called the Partnership for AI, which is a forum which brings all these big companies together, and we're trying to come up with standards on watermarking. But yeah, you bet, I agree. In the end, this technology has to serve society, not the other way around, and I think people do want to feel reassured that it's framed, by coherent regulation and law. But
and as a former policymaker, I mean, asking you to put your former policymaker hat on now rather than I know why you're eager to leave that. But I mean, from that perspective, do you think it is realistic? I mean, you just mentioned, that governments are talking. There's a lot of meetings going on. Do you feel concerned though that policymakers are always sort of several steps behind tech developments? In the United States, Chuck Schumer asked the tech giants to tell me what I should write into law, which is not necessarily a thing that generates confidence, but I mean...
Well, it only doesn't generate confidence if you think that the tech companies are so morally craven that all they're ever going to do is just... I mean, look, I know Meta's got plenty of blemishes on its reputation, I get it, but it is actually populated by human beings who also want their kids to grow up safely. It's not, these are not quite such sort of morally venal institutions. They do also want to try, and yes, they want to try and make a profit. They want to, they're racing against each other, but they also actually want to live in a sustainable, safe society. So I sometimes sort of worry that people say, oh gosh, if it comes from the industry, therefore it can't be a good idea. I think that's a super short-sighted thing to do, because at the end of the day, the legislators don't know how this technology works. You have to get the AI researchers and the scientists to open up a bit and to have a mature conversation with regulators. Otherwise, you're going to end up regulating the wrong thing, or you're going to end up regulating the technology in a way which doesn't actually work in practice. So I think you have to have a grown-up channel of communication between governments and regulators on the one hand, and the engineers and the data scientists and the companies on the other. But to your point, my concern at the moment is a dual one, which is that the debate, firstly, you always, of course, have this mismatch between the speed with which technology develops and the pace at which legislation and regulation is formed. The latter is always slower than the former. That's a familiar problem, and we're seeing it over again. My concern is that is now being coupled with what I believe to be a somewhat paralyzing debate about, oh my gosh, is the end nigh? And I think that's an unhelpful combination. If you're moving too slowly, and at the same time you're kind of thinking, oh wow, it's like this is the end of life as I know it, you kind of end up doing nothing, and or you end up dealing with issues which aren't actually issues you need to deal with today, and you don't deal with them quickly enough, which is why in all of those discussions, both privately and publicly, I am trying to instill a bit of sort of pragmatic urgency and say, look, there are things we need to deal with now. All the stuff we've just talked about, misinformation, watermarking, transparency, red teaming, those are things you can do now. But my worry is if the debate keeps being taken to, is there some existential threat around the corner, you're not going to get the kind of standards. And remember, this is technology where you'll have a lot of churn, you'll have a lot of new market entrants coming in. And if their tools and their AI inventions are not captured by these standards, then you're going to have the big established players operating at those standards, but you're going to have a huge incentive for a lot of smaller players or new ones not to abide by those standards, which is why regulation is necessary.
Right. I mean, we did have a discussion, earlier at this conference about, we had a presentation that basically sort of was showing how AI was being used in various countries, in the voting process, for example, in India, where, thousands of people were, asked various questions about what they want from government and all that kind of thing. And, the AI programs were somewhat limited, but nonetheless, they did apparently an excellent job at pulling together all of that data and sort of showing where all the concerns are, what were the gaps basically between what the democratic institutions were providing and what people, want. So definitely, in that sense, we're not saying that it is necessarily going to destroy the world. There are clearly good things about AI. My neighbor just, only had like an avocado and milk and butter in her refrigerator and asked AI, what could she possibly make with that for dinner tonight? And the AI was able to answer, and it was somewhat tasty. But but that being said, I think, people hear what you're saying about sort of not looking forward at the doom and gloom, but the fact of the matter is that, in the course of history, humankind has always pushed forward, pushed frontiers, pushed boundaries. That's what we do. And I have to ask you this question that actually came up on the previous panel moderated by my colleague, Roger Cohen, where it was a panel about China. And, the point was made by our other colleague, Tom Friedman, on this panel, that, you know, sometimes history throws us surprises. People didn't necessarily see the fall of the Berlin Wall coming. Some people did, but many people did not see Russia suddenly invading Ukraine. So I think, you know, when people raise concerns about what could possibly go wrong with AI, that's a legitimate concern because.
So forgive me. I'm not trying to sound cavalier or dismissive. Of course not. I'm just trying to be pragmatic in answer to your question. We have elections next year. We have 2 billion people voting. These are technologies, as you say, which are already being used. Yeah. So I'm also deriving, you know, from 20 years in public life. There's only so many hours in the day. There's only so many things you can worry about. There's only so many laws you can pass. There's a lot of other things going on. You have to choose. And so why I try and introduce, I hope, a slightly more balanced view of this is I worry that we're getting into a position where we almost end up doing nothing because we're either worrying about threats which haven't arisen yet, and we're not actually, and then we don't spend the time and the effort on dealing with the things that I do think we need to deal with now, which the industry needs to deal with, researchers need to deal with, governments and legislators need to deal with. And I think it is a lot to do with the transparency and the accountability and the safety of these products for everyday use and for democracy as a whole. By the way, just one thing you mentioned, just the Indian example. I do think it'll be interesting to see how AI could be a useful tool on the kind of cutting edge of deliberative democracy, you know, community and citizens, panels and fora. I had a fascinating meeting just last week with a minister in Taiwan, Audrey Tang, and she's. If you haven't really look up what she's doing, it's really fantastic. She uses AI. It's not very sophisticated AI. It's actually but she uses AI to help sort kind of online citizen participation and to try and distill consensus from lots of disparate input and comments. So I do think, oddly enough, that sort of old-fashioned, almost Athenian idea of citizen democracy, a direct democracy, could be aided and assisted by AI in the future as well.
Great. Well, Nick Clegg, thank you very much, and thank you for ending this on a positive note. It was really great to hear your perspective. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's give Nick Clegg a hand for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks very much.